Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending this. The talk that I advertised tonight is a biblical creation through the eyes of a scientist. It was based off of a talk that I did, was invited to do by Jubilee, which is a really big conference that comes to Pittsburgh every year, and I gave it a couple of years ago. The talk that I advertised for that was on a scale that you never imagined, which sort of appeals, I think, maybe a little bit to children when they're thinking about college and life and after college. So it was actually a pretty successful title. And I'm going to talk a little bit about scale throughout this talk, which is something that I think about quite a bit. Of course, I'm going to be talking about science and faith, but before that, I'm going to talk about what I do. So Betsy was talking about my position, my primary appointment, and my PhD is in chemical engineering. And there are seniors who are chemical engineers that come and talk to me all the time, and they say, I don't even understand what chemical engineering is yet. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what a chemical engineer does and how they think about the world, because it's how I think about the world, so that you can understand that a little bit. I am going to talk about science and faith, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a little bit of tensions that exist in science and faith. What I'm not going to do is dig down into these scientific issues. You may have seen talks where people will talk about science and faith. They'll talk about a specific scientific issue, really get down and dirty into the details of it, and argue about that. And that's not the approach that I'm going to take tonight. So before I get started, one thing I do want to say is you should understand that the following opinions may contain features that be disturbing to some viewers. So viewers' discretion is advised. What I'm about to say is not necessarily representative of the University of Pittsburgh or Memorial Park Church or Betsy Broomer or the AV people who helped me to set up this presentation. In deciding whether to pick me to do this talk, I thought, well, why would they want to pick a topic like this? It's so controversial. And I thought, very entertaining, and it's kind of like watching a NASCAR race. So who knows why you watch a NASCAR race? Yeah, for the crashes. So I'm thinking they asked me to come here so you guys could get entertained by watching these crashes. Just from a 30,000 feet perspective, I've been doing this quite a while, and I've given this kind of presentation quite a bit. And when I give this presentation, you may be surprised to hear that the crashes don't often occur when I talk to students, and they don't occur when I'm talking to younger folks. They happen when I'm talking to older folks, right? And yeah, like all of you guys. That's where the crashes occur. And I thought I'd explain a little bit why I think that's the case. And this is, I think, true for anyone. It's true for scientists when I talk to scientists. It's true for Christians when I talk to Christians. And to do that, I'm going to talk just a little bit about something that I do when I teach a class on this particular issue. And that's this, which is the spaghetti challenge. So who has seen the TED Talk on the spaghetti challenge? Anybody? Nobody. Okay, good. So I'll have to explain this. So this is done by Tom Wujek, who's he's a pioneer in business and leadership principles, and he's with Autodesk. And he gives a great presentation on why he does this, and a really funny story about how this relates to human behavior and human thought. The game is basically that if all of you were taking a class on this, and I had 3 classes to teach you, I'd get you in groups of maybe 4 or 5 people. And what I would do is I would give you 15 minutes, okay? I'd give you 20 sticks of spaghetti. I'd give you 1 yard of tape, 1 yard of string, and 1 marshmallow. That's what you have. Your goal is to build the tallest structure in 15 minutes. And what I'm going to do is at the end, we're going to measure to see who won. So this is how this normally goes with adults, okay? Typically what happens is people gather and they look at this and they start talking. You have a period of time where there's orientation, and this is fascinating because you see hierarchy form, and you see people start talking, and who's in charge, and who's going to, say what people are going to do, and then you have people listening and taking notes and organizing things on the table, and you see which people are doing what. Then afterwards, there's some planning, and they say, okay, this is the structure we're going to build and why. And somebody says, well, I'm not sure about that. I think this, and that goes on for a little while longer. Then there's a building phase, okay? Then as we get closer to the end, what happens is you would think that they take the marshmallow and they put it on top and they say, ta-da! But what actually happens most of the times is you have, oh no, and the thing falls down. most of the time whenever you see this happen, okay? So there's actually been some studies that have been done on this to see who has the most oh no moments, okay? So which groups of people, when they have them come in, perform the most poorly? Statistics show that the people who perform the most poorly are recent graduates of business school. Now, there could be a number of reasons why. There's some predictions, but the underlying thought process is, for whatever reason, if you're in business school, there's this idea that there's this hierarchy, there's someone in charge, there's someone underneath, and there's a protocol that you follow. This person gives the rules, the next person does it. There's a very clear plan, and then you go all the way to the end, okay? That's the theory. The ones that do the best at this, believe it or not, are recent graduates of kindergarten. So why is it that little children consistently, statistically, perform better in this test than adults, actually all adults except for, thank goodness, civil engineers? But beyond that, over all adults, kindergartners will perform better. So why is that? And what is thought here is that children don't have any of the pretenses that we do. So what happens is they don't really have the hierarchy. They sit and talk. Everybody says, I think this, and I think this. Let's try. So they try it. And what happens is they build it, and they try to put the marshmallow on it, and it falls down. And they think, oh, well, that didn't work. So they build it again. And they keep building it again and again and again. But what happens with recent business school graduates and other adults is they wait, and they hold it all the way to the end, and they put the marshmallow on top in one last attempt after all this planning in order to fall down. But that's not the most interesting part. So this is a graph of, on average, if you have 10 groups, on average, this is how high the structure will be. So for about 5 or 6 groups, there's some structure. Some of them are high, some are low. And then you see 7, 8, 9, 10, they all fell down, right? What happens now if I take this and I say, I'm going to give you $10,000 if you win to the groups? So if this is what this looks like, what do you think will happen if I say, now you get $10,000 if you win it? What will happen to the distribution of sizes? Will they get bigger? Why don't you think they would get bigger? This is what happens. All of them, on average, fall down. All of them. The reason why is because when there's something at stake, you are even less likely to take risks in your worldview, rewrite your worldview, and everything now is super important. And I think this is interesting because children typically don't have this problem, right? And I think this is actually illustrative of why it's kind of easier for me to talk to teens and college-age students and even 20-age students and 30s. But it gets much, much harder as you go along because people have a lot at stake when it comes to this conversation. It's really important that you recognize this. When you go into this talk about science and faith or any other talk in the future about science and faith, it's very important to recognize that you have a lot at stake in terms of the outcome of this conversation. If the truth is one way or the other, you have built your entire life off some of these things that you've believed for a very long time, and you teach folks those. Maybe you've taught your mentees about this, your children about this, you've lived your life about this. So you have to recognize what you have at stake, because that introduces a bias in terms of how you look at this. And even if there was information out there that was true, you have to realize whether or not you're even willing to accept that information as to whether it's true. And this is true for scientists too. It's true for scientists and it's true for Christians. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and about what I do before I get into this topic. This is my family, who is actually sitting over here, some of them. So this is Aaron here over on your right. And then Heather, this is my beautiful wife, and then Kate's in the middle, and then Drew is over here on the end. So ultimately, me being a scientist and a Christian, when I think about all of this stuff, one thing I think is very important before we move forward in this, and that's that you need to realize that I truly believe deep down in my bones, in my spirit, in my heart, in my mind, that God is real. As a scientist, I believe he's real. So what do I mean when I say he's real? He's real, real. Not like some imaginary concept real. Like if I were to come out and touch you and poke you, you're real. Like he's real, real. Like he's sitting in this room real. So I want to make sure that that is clear before I go further in this conversation at all. And this makes some scientists upset. I don't think it would make you upset, but it's important for you to recognize that. I also am a chemical engineer, and I've talked about this here a little bit so far. So what is a chemical engineer? Here's some things that chemical engineers make that you might see all the time. Robotics and toothpaste. You ever know the viscosity of toothpaste, how it changes when it's in the bottle as it goes through the hole out onto your toothbrush? That's something a chemical engineer does. Drug delivery, which is what I do. Formulation of drugs in pharmaceutical science has a tremendous amount of chemical engineering. Clean drinking water, the fuel that you have in your gas tank, and the food that you eat. Okay? Now, those are the applications of chemical engineering, but it's not the basis of it. The basis of it, when I try to speak to students who are even seniors that come into my office, what I try to explain to them is that the real core of what a chemical engineer does is it deals with the issue of scale. Okay, so when I say scale, what I do not mean is these kind of scales. I do not mean like snake scales or scale you step on in the morning to measure your weight or music scales. In order to demonstrate the concept of scale to you and what chemical engineers do, I want to show you a little video here that was actually done by a guy named Daniel Oberskopf, who's an astrophysicist. And what he did is he created a little video that is kind of like Google Earth. Have you ever seen Google Earth on your phone? You can zoom in and out of the Earth and look into various things. What he did is he did this, and he created it to look at the scale of the entire known universe and all known scales. I'm going to play that for you right now. So the name of the woman in that video is Louise, and it's centered around Louise. It goes out as large as we know is the scale and goes in to her as far as we know the scale goes in the universe. And this has always fascinated me. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be an astronomer because it promised studying a world that was beyond ours, where the rules were different and things were on scales that people had a hard time imagining, hence the title of my talk. Ended up actually going the other way. Ended up studying super tiny things. Typically, chemical engineers study things as far over as what you see on your left here, which is like the size of molecules in DNA, and how that impacts what cells do, how that impacts what happens on the biological scale, which one of the things I look at is the human eye, but you could imagine other things on that scale, all the way to the size of the Earth. And how all of this crosses the boundaries of the scales and is orchestrated together, even on principles at the atomic scale that are very hard for people who don't understand this to imagine. How molecules move around in ways that we just don't see in our regular world. And on super large scales, how things happen that are very hard to imagine in what you see in regular life. All of this is what chemical engineers do in order to make products for people and do things on the scale of a human being. And all of this orchestration is something that I've always been fascinated with, and it's kind of like this, right? So I sit in my office, and I just look at the wonder of it all. And that's why I do what I do, is it's just so awesome to me, the world that I live in. In contrast to this and how God, I think, has orchestrated all of this, this is sort of like what I look like. I sit and like a little child, right? And when my children were growing up, they would look at me and they would say, why, Daddy, why? And that's sort of what I feel like. I'm asking why. And one trick that I learned with my kids is that if you say to them, you tell me why, because otherwise they just keep asking you why. But if you say to them, you tell me why, start to see their head turn and them learn things and do all that stuff. So I constantly feel like I sit in my office and I look like this and I say, why, God? And he says, you tell me why. And that's what I do in my regular life. My research group at the University of Pittsburgh, Betsy said that I'm a professor, which you should not imagine me just teaching classes and then going home all summer and doing nothing. I actually run the University of Pittsburgh's Controlled Release and Drug Delivery Lab. What we do, and we've sort of started this field, new exciting field of medicine, that's called biomimetics. So what we do is we create tiny little things that imitate and replicate what life does on that small scale. And in doing that, we're able to make medicine that can do things that no medicines have been shown to do before. They're futuristic medicines. And this is the pitch I use to recruit graduate students to my group. And I think we've done some pretty cool stuff, but this is what I personally work on. Another way to think about this, if I were to use an analogy as a research mentor and a professor, is I'm kind of like a Y tree. So what happens is that I'm like a tree that sprouts out questions, and we ask these questions. Ultimately, at one point in time, one of them falls to the ground, and I hope that they turn into another Y tree. And those are my graduate students and my postdocs that go on to ask other questions, and then hopefully produce even more questions that end up going on and get answered. I'm also chair of an academic department, and the best way I could describe that is I'm kind of like a Y tree farmer. So I take care of these weird, wonderful things that we call Y trees. They require a lot of nutrients. They require a lot of space between each other because they fight if you get them too close to one another. And even once you do all of that stuff, they still complain to the farmer a lot. But after a while, you get to the point where you actually love, working with these farmers and creating a ground where they can grow and more questions can be asked and more trees grow. So that's kind of what I do as a chair of a department. And this is my backdrop. So this is my backdrop in which I interact with the world. So on this backdrop, I build relationships. I learn who these people are, invest in their lives, show them that I care about them. And this is how I am able to interface with all of them and bring, in some way, shape, or form, depending on the circumstance, Christ into their lives. So this is my backdrop. Whatever your backdrop is, always, always remember that these people that you are working with in your world, they will take a little piece of you with them when they go, just like my students take a piece of me when I go. I always get told that I have actually picked up quite a number of the same worldview and mannerisms and things of my PhD advisor. And that actually happens with my students as well. Whatever your backdrop is, whoever you interact with, realize that you're rubbing off on people as you do it. And what you say and how you say it is important and matters. Okay, on to a little bit of science and faith. You might think, based on everything that I've seen, with the basis of your worldview, which I would imagine is Christian, probably evangelical Christian. From the basis of that worldview, you probably looked at everything I just showed you in that video and you think, how in the world could somebody not be a scientist and believe that there's a God? You'd be wrong. You'd be very wrong. In fact, when you look at statistics, although I recognize that you guys can't see this if you're looking up here, this, I guess, was designed for a bigger screen in a room. But a Pew Research study suggests, and if you can see the bars on the top here, the big green bar that you see are those who believe in God, and the top one is the general public, and the bottom one is scientists. So you can see the drop. The next one is they don't believe in God, but they believe in some universal higher power, and then the next one is who don't believe in God at all. Notably, on the top one, the ones who don't believe in God at all in the general population is 4%. Underneath of it are scientists, it's 41%. 10 times more scientists don't believe in God than the general public. That's just the way that it is. Other interesting things that were done, a study by Rice University in 2014 looked at the general population and their view of how scientists and Christians are dealing with this issue. 27% of Americans believe that science and religion are in conflict, irrevocable conflict. 48% of evangelical Christians believe that science and religion are in conflict. So if you're an evangelical Christian, you're over double times more likely to believe that there's a war going on this issue than the general public. 20% of all people believe that religious people are hostile to scientists. 22% of people believe that scientists are hostile to religious people. So that's part of the reason why you see something like this. And I'm going to sort of give you just a quick snippet, in my opinion, based on I live in both worlds, what I think the main reason that there's the car crashes with this in terms of science and in terms of Christians. So if I were to look at scientists and really criticize me and other scientists, I think that scientists really seem to have a problem with this thing that we call anecdotal evidence. So Christians would probably call that personal testimony. Scientists have a real problem with this, right? So what this is evidence obtained in casual or informal manner with reliance on personal testimony, or not objectively collected in terms of data, okay? Now, you need to use real extreme caution, and now I'm making fun of scientists here. You only use anecdotal evidence when you're determining when to cross the street, deciding your college major, deciding who you're going to marry, buying a house, buying a car, deciding how to raise your children, and rulings by judges in U.S. district courts. That's the only time you should use anecdotal evidence, apparently. But scientists get to the point where it sort of is like this, and it's almost crippling. So this is a funny comic. It says The Atheist Cafe, and if you can't read it, there's a bunch of atheists sitting around having some coffees, and it says, I can't believe how good this is. I can't believe these prices. I can't believe we've never come here before. I can't believe anything. Right? But of course, you wouldn't be able to live your life that way. So it's this, I think, overinflated view of what they know, and that ultimately they are the only ones that can determine whether something is true or not. Now, don't laugh too hard, because I'm going to make fun of myself as a Christian now, okay? Before I do that, I just want to say one thing about the scientific method in science. I believe that the scientific method works using Homo sapien logic, human logic, in the physical universe. I believe that God is not a Homo sapien, and I do not believe that he lives in the physical universe. He can if he wants, but he's outside of the physical universe. So therefore, it's useless to try to prove or disprove the existence of God using the scientific method. I just believe it doesn't even apply to a being like that. So that's my opinion on that. So if this is what talking to scientists does whenever I talk to them, this is typically what it's like when I talk to Christians. And I think if I were to pick one thing that I think with the Christians that I think is the reason why we have this problem, is actually kind of the same root, but I put this up here, and that's that most Christians that I talk to believe that their understanding of God fits in their pocket. If they can't understand what it is or how it works or who God is and how it works, and it doesn't fit in here, they don't want to hear it. And they're not open to listening to other things about different interpretations of Scripture or different scientific theories. And this frustrates the living heck out of scientists. In the end, it all comes down to the same thing, which is that the Christians that have the biggest problem with this, I think, believe that they are the ones who can understand things. They're the only ones because they've been given this information, and that you can't. It's actually the exact same problem, just from a different perspective. So that's my view on this. Instead of diving into any science, what I do when I talk to Christians on this issue is actually go here. So this is where I want to talk about first. I actually think that some Christians do check their brain at the door whenever they talk about science, but I actually think that some Christians check their brain at the door when they read the Bible. There's things they've heard all their life, and they just don't even objectively look at it anymore. Instead, when I talk to our high schoolers, or I talk to college students, what I do is do this. I just say, let's just take Genesis 1 and 2, have you read it, and I just ask you, give them some time, get them in groups, and I just say, what similarities do you see? What differences do you see? And is there anything curious about these accounts as you read them? I just say, anything. And they get in their groups and they sit down and they write things, and the stuff they come up with is actually absolutely remarkable. That's not the kind of stuff that I hear whenever I talk to other folks who are older who read Genesis 1 or Genesis 2. It seems like those folks have already made up their mind. So I'm going to just give you a couple of examples. This is not inclusive. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples in the time that I have. The first is when you read Genesis 1, I think that you should notice a pattern when you read it. So on day 1, okay, you have a problem that's presented, which is darkness, okay? So what God does to solve this problem is he creates light, okay? On day 2, you have a problem, which is a watery abyss. So what does God do to solve this problem? Right? So he creates, and I'll talk about this just in a minute, waters above and below and the sky. Waters above and waters below in the sky. So what he does, instead of a watery abyss, he organizes it, okay? Next thing is the formless earth. The problem. What does he do to fix it? The land and the vegetation, okay? But if you keep reading on, now on day 4, what do you see? On day 4, you see what some people call the rulers of each of those things. So you see the sun, the moon, and the stars. So notice there's light before any sun and moon and stars. That comes all the way to day 4. But you see the introduction of something that would rule over light and darkness. The next is the watery abyss. What do you see that's made on day 5? Birds and fish. And then the next day, what you see is land, animals, and man. This is a poetic structure. This is not a literal structure. It's a poetic structure. But, maybe you don't believe me. You think that this is a literal structure. That's fine. I can talk about some other things in a second. But if it is a poetic structure, if it is not a literal structure, if you're willing to just think about that for a second, if this isn't literal, think for just a little while. Are you daring to think a little while about what could God have intended to be communicating if this is not literal? Let me give you another example. So we talked about this separation between the waters and the sky. Most folks that I talk to just skip over this. But the teenagers, they're all over this. What the heck are you talking about? Waters above, waters below. What is this? The actual word that is used is expanse or firmament. And you can even search for this yourself. If you go online, you can look and see the underlying word that was used, which is rakia. Did I pronounce that correctly? Yeah. So the word actually means, and I know you can't see this, an extended surface, expanse, and firmament is another word for it. But what that means is that it is a vault of heaven supporting waters above, considered by the Hebrews as solid and supporting the waters above. So what this actually is, and the best description of this I've seen is a book actually by one of my faculty members, Bob Enoch, who's a chemical engineer who wrote about this. And what he does is he uses some references to describe what, at the time, the ancient Mesopotamians who would have lived around this area, what was their current state-of-the-art view of science? What did they believe the world looked like? And in fact, what they thought is that, you're walking on the ground, okay? You see water over here, okay? What color is that? Blue, okay? You look up, what do you see? Blue. Oh, not in Pittsburgh, but if you live there, it's blue, okay? So what they believed is that there was waters below, and the blue was waters above, and there was a giant glass dome that kept that. So that's what the waters above and the waters below were. They literally believed that there were pillars of the earth that were in the ground that held this glass. No, it had seen them, but they believed that there were pillars holding this glass thing up. The other thing that this thing explained for them, right, is rain. So they believed that every once in a while there would be holes or something would happen and the water would come down. So this was the ancient state-of-the-art Mesopotamian, and it's not just in this book. You can just Google this for firmament, and you can see. Right? So this is like well-known science that was the state of the art at the time. Okay? Now, this really bothers some people, that the current view of science is not in Genesis 1. Because they really like to think that the Bible is everything. It's like a science book. It should be a science book. It should represent all of that. Right? But what this represented this, and if we were to go today and go in and I were to ask you, or God, let's say God asked you, inspired you to rewrite the science of Genesis 1, you know what? It would be wrong too. Because our understanding of science right now isn't right either. And if you look at the theories that are coming out, even just about the nature of the universe, E8 theory, 256 symmetries, all of this stuff makes us understand that we don't even have a clue about how some of this stuff works in our universe, right? So if you are able to take a step out for just a second and say, what if Genesis 1 was not intended to communicate science? What then could it be intended to communicate? Let me give you another example. So that's dinosaurs. There's two dinosaurs looking at the ark saying, oh crap, was that today? This is in D.C. Where's my son Aaron? He left. This is Aaron. I can't believe he was this little. He's 13 now. He's huge. So this was Aaron. And what is he looking at? Who's a dinosaur buff in here? Who knows what the fossil is for this? No. This is a megalodon. Who was that? Nice. This is a megalodon. So this thing was absolutely massive. There's a movie right now that has come out called The Meg. Go home and just type in The Meg and look at the trailer. That's what the megalodon was supposed to be. And just to give you some scale, this is how old was Aaron? 4 or 5-year-old, standing in the jaws of one of these megalodons, right? It'd be like a gummy bear. So just look at it. Look at his face. He's looking at this thing, right? That's one amazed gummy bear. So I have heard some crazy things that I've heard Christians talk about in terms of like how this could be explained in the context of the Bible. Job 41 is one of them. I've heard Christians say, can you pull the Leviathan with a fishhook or down its tongue with a rope? And Psalm 104, the ships go by to and fro, and the Leviathan who you formed frolic there. So perhaps that is something that the Bible says, and that accounts for some of these dinosaurs. Because, swam in the ocean, was absolutely huge. Maybe that's the Leviathan. The problem is, what is that then? There's so many of these different species, like walked around all over the earth. Some of them flew over top in the sky. And you're not telling me that somewhere in the Bible, somebody's not writing a prayer, like Abraham's not writing some prayer, say, God, please save me from these pterodactyls that came and got my Aunt Janet. Nowhere do you see prayers for these giant creatures that could kill you and destroy everything you have. It just seems so far-fetched to me. So, one thing has to be true. Let's say you believe that some science is in Genesis, and that's right. You disagree with me. That's fine. Let's say you do believe that there's dinosaurs and those are described, right? We have to at least agree, and if we don't, we're at an impasse here. We have to agree that the Bible didn't intend to inform us about everything. We have to agree that, right? It did not intend to give us all of the different dinosaurs or modern physics. It did not intend to do that. So, if that is the case, then what did the Bible intend to tell us, if that's not what it was? I'll give you another example. And I recognize that actually for the folks back here looking at the screen, you probably can read this. I recognize when I set this up that you can't read this either. If you have a Bible in front of you, you can pull up Genesis 4, or you can get your phone and read it. If you don't want to, I swear I'll read it and I didn't change it. You can check it later. That was certainly not my intent. But I want to read a couple parts of this to you because it's absolutely fascinating to me. And when I show this to adults, they don't see any of this stuff. But when I show it to kids, they catch it all. It's fascinating. So I'm going to just make a couple drawings here, and we're going to do a count. So if this is the earth. Now, in chapter 4, it says Adam made love to his wife Eve. In the Bible, from Genesis 1 to 4, who does the Bible talk about in terms of people on the earth? Adam? Okay, I got to make sure I keep count here. So here's Adam. Who else does it talk about? Eve, okay. So we're going to put Eve here. I don't have brown, so I'm going to do this. Of course, if she was beautiful, she was a brunette, Heather, but all I have is this. So she has to be a blonde. So there's Adam and Eve here, okay? So if he made love to his wife Eve, she became pregnant, and she gave birth to Cain. So here's Cain. Whoop. Here's Cain here. Right? So then now Abel's born. A little bit farther down. So here's Abel. Okay. So now, without reading this too much further, you guys could probably tell me what happens next. If we're counting 4, what happens next? We're going to take one away, aren't we? What happens? Yeah, Abel kills Cain. So we're going to put... We've got Halloween going on here. I guess blood splattering. Right? So, dead. Right? So now we're at 3, okay? And what happens is it says, Cain says to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. Now down in 13. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Wait a minute. What do you mean, whoever finds me will kill me? Are we just talking about Adam and Eve, your parents? Right? My kids do kind of stuff all the time, and I say, I'm going to kill them, but I don't know if I mean that. Maybe they did mean that. Well, let's just keep going here and see what the rest of the story says. So then it says, the Lord says, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Maybe that's Adam and Eve. The Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Okay? Then it says, Cain made love to his wife. Wait a minute. We had someone just appear here. Maybe she has blue hair. Someone just appeared. So who is Cain's wife? Maybe you'll say to me, okay, well, the Bible doesn't talk about this, but Adam and Eve had more babies, and this is his sister. I'll talk about that one in just a second. Hold on to that. Okay, made love to his wife, and she became pregnant, gave birth to Enoch. Then Cain was building a city. A city. So now we got a city. Oh, we got a city for 4 people? We got a city now. Apparently we need a city. And named it after his son Enoch. Then Lamech married 2 women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. So now we have 2 more people that have appeared. These other women that have appeared. And we keep going again, and I just want to take you down to 25, because this addressed the question that I've said earlier. Adam then says, it says in 25, Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Now, maybe you say, okay, well, you got to do some mental gymnastics here at least. You have to agree with me to get to the point where you've got all these other women and cities and all kinds of other stuff. But one thing that you have to agree with me on this is that even if you say all of that stuff, the Bible doesn't tell us all that stuff. The Bible was not intended to tell us all of that stuff. So if the Bible is not a complete guide to the universe and everything that happened in history and all of science, what could it intended to communicate? Okay, let me jump out of Scripture. I don't want to stay on that all night. What about evolution? Okay, so this is the big one that I talk about with most people where I work, the primordial soup. How is it possible that this could be? I've heard a lot of debates about this. I'm going to go through what I think are some misconceptions, but I think when it really comes down to it, it comes down to, I think, kind of one main question. If natural selection even is a reasonable theory, and I'm not intending any of you to agree or disagree with me with that tonight, could that have actually been something God used to create it, is the question that I ask. So perhaps you think it's a ridiculous theory because you've seen some things on it. That's fine. But if it is something that is reasonable, that's the question. Someone who you might have run into that are not in my circles, the nerdy people in my circles, somebody that you might have run into that talks about this is Hank Hanegraaff. So he's had a radio show. I believe it is played on Word FM. And actually, Hank, I think he's called the Bible Answer Man. If you don't recognize the name, Hank Hanegraaff. I actually think that a lot of the things that Hank does and says are really good. I think he's really good at what he does. I think he handles these questions very well, and I think he's doing a really great thing and a very noble thing. On this issue, I disagree with him, and I'll tell you why. One night I was listening to a show about all of this stuff, and I was sitting there thinking this exact same question. Well, he's talking about evolution a lot, but what if it is? Let's just take this and put it aside. If that is true, could God have used it to create mankind? And I thought I'd call, so I actually got on the phone, and I rang in. I just said I want to hear what he says about this particular issue. And I got through. And I was like, oh, this is great. So I asked that question, and they said, someone has already asked that question. He's going to answer it in just a minute. And I was like, okay. So I hung up the phone, patiently waited for 10 minutes. And then the question came on. The caller got on the line and asked this question. Could God have used natural selection to create human beings? This was Hank's answer, okay? And I think it reveals a lot about the thinking of this. Natural selection is cruel and random. This is clearly not how God does things. So I'm going to say that again, because it's got a whole bunch of assumptions in it. Natural selection is cruel and random. This is clearly not how God does things. So I want to address a couple of misconceptions that are in here because they're truly wrong, in my humble opinion. The first is this one, and that's that natural selection is cruel. And this comes from the basis that you understand, you've heard before, that the strong survive, okay? And that means strong equals, at least in Hank's mind, cruel, brutal, maybe sinful, that God doesn't do things like that, okay? This is actually a misconception. The truth is that natural selection means strong equals alive and sexy. That's what natural selection actually means, alive and sexy. So clearly, if you're dead, you can't have sex. All right? But you also have to be sexy to have sex. And if you're not, then it's not happening. Right? So that's what natural selection is. So to demonstrate this, what I do, and this hits home right whenever I do it with the teenagers, I ask the girls, which one of these two would you prefer for a mate? Right? Clearly, everybody picks Brad Pitt. Right? Because that's the fittest. That's the strong in natural selection, okay? So it's not cruel. That's a misconception, all right? The second misconception that is in this is evolution is random, okay? Now, what I'm not saying is there is not some probabilistic portion of evolution. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that this is not right. It's not that God's throwing dice. If you actually understand the fundamental processes behind this, you understand that it's not random at all. It's based on pressures and stresses that are in the environment. And you can see remarkable things developing. Now, there is microevolution, which I actually do in the lab all the time. I actually have a product right now, a medicine that is an evolved bacteria that I've been working on. Okay? That happens all the time. So if that's not true, then I can't see straight, and the stuff that I understand isn't real, right? But macroevolution is something that we can't see because we're like literally living inside of this giant experiment that goes so far forward and back that we can't even imagine it. So it's very, very hard to wrap your head around, okay? But one thing I can tell you is it's not random, and I have seen people tell me before, well, what about this structure in biology? You can't prove that that could have ever come about by natural selection. And then like 2 years later, I go to a conference and somebody shows how it could happen. This stuff happens in science all the time. And I just do not like the stance that people take that I can't understand how it happens or look how flabbergasting these numbers are. We're never going to be able to figure it out. I have seen people figure out things that I didn't think they would ever figure out. So I'm not saying evolution is right, but what I am saying is that that's a bad argument to say that it's too big for me to understand. Okay? The next thing I'll just say on this issue is that a lot of the times people use this watchmaker analogy. I hear it all the time. I just cannot understand this. So people say, well, you're walking along a beach and you find some watch someplace. So how could you possibly not understand that this watch couldn't have been made by God? Well, you would have to think there's a mommy watch and a daddy watch, and there's other things that are like watches, and then you have a watch. I mean, like the premise of the whole argument's wrong. The premise of the whole argument isn't right. I mean, presented in that way without all of the premise, then sure, that's right. But it makes it seem like it's so much more random than it is. And it's not as random as it gets made out to be. But in the end, in Hank's argument, and I think in many others that I heard, those two are misconceptions, but the real big one is this one. It's the big boo-boo. And that's that any of us would pretend to know how God does things. How dare us think that we know how God does anything? That we would know that. So I would think that if the Bible is not supposed to tell us how, what if the Bible is just meant to tell us who? And that's what the Bible is supposed to be. In order to finish this up, I just want to use one more analogy here. If you just follow me for just a minute, you'll see why I'm doing this, and that's this next thing. So I absolutely hate picking up leaves. I hate it. My father used to make me do it when I was little all the time. We lived in a yard with so many trees that just came down and never-ending leaves. And I just spent my entire childhood, I feel like, picking up leaves. I absolutely hate it. So as I pick up leaves, I sit and think of all the ways that I could come up with so I don't have to pick up another leaf ever again in my life. So just fields and fields and fields of them. So I always spent this time, what would be smarter than me going around and picking up all these daggone things? Well, here's one thing that would be smarter, right? Instead of picking each up one at a time, you could get a rake. That would be smarter than picking them up, right? I think we've probably got that one figured out, okay? A lot of people use rake. What would even be smarter than a rake? Who's got an idea? Yeah, children's a good one. We'll get back to that one. A blowtorch, yeah, that would be really fun. If you hate them a lot, you could just set them all on fire. But if you'd like to keep the value of your property, another way to do this would be a leaf blower, right? If you had a leaf blower, that's even better than a rake. You just go out and go, and you get a really powerful one. It works great. Okay? But what would even be smarter than that? Yeah, cut down the trees is a good one. You know, what about a riding mower where it picks them up, sucks them up inside of there? Now we're getting more complicated, right? We're getting more complicated than a rake. But now people have come up with these things, and they've built them to pick up leaves. And then they sell them for money because they value, because people don't want to pick up leaves. Okay? But what would even be smarter than this? What if you were to, create a computer that would go around and pick them up yourself? Then you wouldn't even have to have your kids do it, right? This program and thing would go, you buy it, or maybe you just make it yourself, and it goes around and just picks all the leaves up, right? That would just be even smarter, wouldn't it be? If you could do that. So what I'd like to say is, what if we were to imagine that in making things and in doing things that God does, just for a minute, dream with me for a minute, what if the scale's bigger than we ever imagined? So rather than him physically making the earth, right? What if he did something else? What if he made something that made the thing that he was trying to make? He would have to be even smarter, right? Because he would have to know what he wanted to make. And then he would have to make that other thing so that it made that exactly the way that he wanted it, right? That would be really, really smart. But wait a minute. Dream for another second. What if he created a system that was able to make something, or even make something that then made something that he wanted to make? That would be mind-blowingly smart, right? He'd have to create this entire system, a computer program inside of it. And in fact, there are even some people that I know in my field that have created computer models of physics in the real world that actually lead to the creation of things that we've been trying to figure out how are made in real life for the last 80 years. Now, nobody says that, oh, it'd just be so much smarter if you just made it. No, these people figured out how to create a system that would result in it being made. And they're celebrating that. But this is, in fact, way less than what God would have actually do. What if God created a system that was able to make something, and then that thing made a system that was able to make the thing that you're trying to make? This is a level of intelligence that completely blows my mind. Imagine if from the very beginning of the universe, he created the system that would make molecules, DNA, that would make cells, that would make people, that would come in contact with each other, that you're sitting next to right now. And some people tell me, well, that doesn't sound as personal of the God that I believed in. Well, what if I were to tell you that it is just as personal, and he had to be that smart to have cared for every single little piece of it, such that your parents and their parents all impacted you and the person sitting next to you and the people that come across you, so that every single thing in your life is intentional? That's a view of God that is so big that I think people have a hard time wrapping their heads around, which makes it even harder for them to consider some of these things that we're talking about. It's certainly the opposite of having God in your pocket. Certainly the opposite of it. So, now, what do I think? If you ask me what I think, okay, let's say that I, tomorrow, go out and I get hit by a bus. And I go up to heaven and I'm standing there and I finally see him. And I just say, wow, God, how did you do all this? And God says to me, I made everything in 6 24-hour days. What I'm going to say to him is, wow, I knew you could do it. But if he says instead to me, Steve, you spent a lot of time on science. Your science is right, but it's not all right. I had to step in and I had to physically do these things in order for things to actually happen. So the universe I made couldn't actually make all of this stuff happen. I had to actually make something, and then I had to step in and actually do the rest of it. If he says that to me, what I'm going to say to him is, wow, I knew you could do it. And if instead he says to me, I planned everything, from atoms to planets to bacteria to human cells to people, in every single part of your life from the very beginning of time, and I made a system that could do all of that. I never had to step into it because I made all of that myself. And I did that 14 billion years ago. I'm going to say, wow, I knew you could do it. Because I think that what we're missing when we talk about this with the rest of the world is humility. I think humility is different. I think that it's rare, especially whenever people are talking about this. And I think it'll make people wonder about you. What's different about that person? And it might even end up being a backdrop in which you can share your worldview, your moral compass, your temperance, your values, and how you communicate this to the rest of the world, regardless of what you believe. It can be done with love, as if you're doing it for Christ and you're not doing it for yourself. And that, remember, you have to always remember that people are going to take a piece of you with them whenever they go.